When doctors tell you that your chances of survival are 0%, when medical textbooks say your condition is universally fatal, when specialists shake their heads and suggest you prepare for the worst, what do? Most people would surrender to despair. Most people would accept their fate. Sarah Mitchell was not most people. At 28 years old, she received a diagnosis that would have broken anyone else. The rare autoimmune disease attacking her nervous system had a mortality rate of 100% within 2 years of onset. Every documented case in medical history had ended the same way. Every single one. But Sarah had something the medical journals couldn't measure. She had an unbreakable spirit that refused to accept the impossible. She had a determination that would rewrite the rules of survival itself. And she had a plan that no one saw coming. This is the story of how one woman turned medical impossibility into miraculous reality, step by extraordinary step. This is the story of the survivor they said could never exist. Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who solved problems rather than dwelling on them. As a mechanical engineer working for a major aerospace company, she approached challenges with logic, research, and unwavering determination. So when she started experiencing strange symptoms in the spring of 2019, she treated it like any other puzzle that needed solving. It began with a tingling sensation in her fingertips during important client meetings. At first, she dismissed it as stress from the demanding project deadlines. But the tingling spread to her toes, then her hands, then her feet. Within weeks, she noticed her handwriting becoming shaky, her usually precise engineering drawings looking more like a child's scribbles. The numbness came next, starting as patches of skin that felt disconnected from her body. She would touch her arm and feel nothing, as if she were wearing thick gloves. Her colleagues at the engineering firm started commenting on her clumsiness. Sarah, who had always prided herself on her steady hands and precise movements, found herself dropping coffee cups and struggling to hold her drafting tools. By summer, the weakness had begun. Simple tasks like opening jars or lifting her laptop bag became monumental challenges. She finally scheduled an appointment with her family doctor, expecting to receive a prescription for vitamins or stress medication. Instead, Dr. Patterson referred her to a neurologist with an urgency that made Sarah's stomach drop. The neurologist, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. She performed test after test, each one more complex than the last. Sarah underwent nerve conduction studies that sent electrical pulses through her limbs, MRI scans that captured detailed images of her brain and spine, and blood work that filled vial after vial with her Crimson Life Force. During the waiting period between tests and results, Sarah threw herself into research. She spent her evenings after work scouring medical journals and databases, trying to understand what might be happening to her body. Her engineering mind demanded data, facts, explanations. She created spreadsheets tracking her symptoms, noting patterns, and progressions with the same methodical approach she used for her aircraft design projects. The search led her down rabbit holes of rare neurological conditions. She read about multiple sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, and dozens of other disorders that could explain her symptoms. Each condition she researched seemed to offer some hope, some treatment options, some chance of management or recovery. 3 weeks after her initial neurologist appointment, Dr. Rodriguez called and asked Sarah to come in immediately, bringing a family member or close friend. The tone of the doctor's voice told Sarah everything she needed to know before she even stepped foot in the medical office. This was not going to be good news. Sarah's sister Emma accompanied her to the appointment, both women sitting in uncomfortable silence in the sterile waiting room. When they were finally called back, Dr. Rodriguez wasted no time with pleasantries. She pulled up Sarah's test results on her computer screen and turned to face both sisters with a grave expression. The diagnosis was progressive multifocal autoimmune polyneuropathy, a condition so rare that fewer than 50 cases had ever been documented in medical literature. The disease caused the immune system to attack the protective covering of nerve fibers throughout the body, leading to rapid deterioration of motor function, sensation, and eventually autonomic systems like breathing and heart function. Dr. Rodriguez explained that every single documented case had resulted in complete paralysis within 6 months of symptom onset, followed by respiratory failure within 18 to 24 months. There were no survivors in the medical literature. None. The condition was considered universally fatal, with no known treatments that could slow or stop its progression. Sarah listened to the explanation with the same focused attention she brought to complex engineering problems. She asked questions about the pathophysiology, the timeline, the specific mechanisms by which the disease progressed. Dr. Rodriguez answered each query with clinical precision, but Sarah could see the sadness in the doctor's eyes. Emma broke down, crying in the chair beside her, but Sarah remained composed, her mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. This was just another challenge, albeit the most significant one she had ever faced. If every documented case had ended in death, then the solution simply hadn't been found yet. Someone needed to be the first survivor, and Sarah decided that someone would be her. After the appointment, Emma wanted to take Sarah home and spend the day comforting her, but Sarah had other plans. She dropped her sister off and drove directly to the university medical library. She had research to do. The next several weeks became a blur of medical journals, research papers, and correspondence with specialists around the world. Sarah reached out to every researcher who had published anything related to her condition. She contacted pharmaceutical companies working on experimental treatments for similar autoimmune disorders. She even connected with veterinary researchers studying comparable conditions in animals. Most of the responses were polite but discouraging. The disease was simply too rare, too aggressive, and too poorly understood for there to be any meaningful research into treatments. The few experimental therapies that existed for related conditions had shown no efficacy against her specific variant of the disease. But Sarah's engineering background had taught her that every system, no matter how complex, could be understood and potentially modified. She began to view her condition not as a death sentence, but as an engineering challenge that required innovative thinking and unconventional approaches. She started documenting everything about her condition with scientific precision. She tracked her symptoms hourly, noting correlations with diet, sleep, stress levels, weather patterns, and dozens of other variables. She purchased medical equipment to monitor her nerve function at home, creating detailed graphs of her condition's progression. What she discovered surprised her. While the overall trend was clearly degenerative, there were periods of stability and even slight improvement. These fluctuations didn't match the textbook description of relentless, linear decline. Sarah realized that the medical literature might be incomplete based on too few cases to establish accurate patterns. She reached out to support groups for people with similar conditions, hoping to find others who might have experienced unexpected variations in their disease progression. Most of the connections led to heartbreaking stories of loss, but occasionally she found patients who had lived longer than expected or experienced periods of improvement that their doctors couldn't explain. One contact proved particularly valuable. Marcus Thompson, a patient in London with a related condition, had survived 3 years beyond his predicted lifespan by pursuing an aggressive combination of experimental treatments, dietary modifications, and lifestyle changes that he had designed himself. Marcus wasn't cured, but he was alive and functional when he should have been dead. Marcus became Sarah's first mentor in the art of survival against impossible odds. He shared his research, his treatment protocols, and, most importantly, his mindset. He had refused to accept the medical establishment's timeline for his death and had instead created his own timeline for living. Through Marcus, Sarah connected with an underground network of patients and caregivers who were pioneering their own treatments for rare and supposedly incurable conditions. They called themselves the impossible patients, and they shared a common philosophy. When conventional medicine offers no hope, you create your own hope through research, experimentation, and unwavering determination. By autumn, Sarah's symptoms had progressed to the point where she could no longer work effectively. Her hands shook too much for precise drafting, and the fatigue was overwhelming. She made the difficult decision to take medical leave from her job, using the time to pursue her survival research full-time. Her family and friends struggled to understand her approach. They wanted her to rest, to spend time with loved ones, to accept comfort and palliative care. But Sarah had never been the type to go gently into any situation, and she wasn't about to start now. She converted her spare bedroom into a research laboratory, complete with medical monitoring equipment, a library of research materials, and sophisticated computer systems for data analysis. Her dining room table became a command center where she coordinated communications with researchers, doctors, and fellow patients around the world. The progression of her condition continued, but Sarah noticed that her meticulous tracking was revealing patterns that gave her hope. The disease wasn't progressing as uniformly as the medical literature suggested. There were variables that seemed to influence the rate of decline, and if there were variables, that meant there might be ways to manipulate those variables in her favor. Winter brought new challenges as her condition worsened, but it also brought new discoveries. Sarah had identified several potential intervention strategies based on her research, and she was ready to begin the experimental phase of her survival plan. She knew the medical establishment would not support her approach, so she would have to become her own doctor, researcher, and guinea pig. The first phase of her battle against the impossible was complete. She had gathered intelligence, identified potential weapons, and built a network of allies. Now came the real test, proving that the medical textbooks were wrong, and that survival was possible for someone willing to rewrite the rules entirely. As she prepared for the next phase of her journey, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that first tingling in her fingertips. She was no longer the same person who had received that devastating diagnosis. She had transformed from a patient accepting a death sentence into a warrior preparing for the fight of her life. The doctors had told her that no one survives her condition. Sarah was determined to prove them wrong, one step at a time. The winter of 2020 marked the beginning of what Sarah privately called her experimental phase. Armed with months of research and a network of unconventional allies, she was ready to challenge medical orthodoxy with her own carefully designed survival protocol. What she was about to attempt had never been tried before, and failure could mean accelerating her own death. Sarah's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: veterinary medicine. While researching similar autoimmune conditions in animals, she discovered that veterinarians had been experimenting with combination therapies that human medicine had deemed too risky or unconventional. A veterinary neurologist in Colorado had published promising results treating dogs with a comparable condition using a protocol that combined low-dose chemotherapy agents, targeted immune suppressants, and hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The treatment approach was radical because it attempted to reset the immune system rather than simply suppressing it. Traditional medicine avoided such aggressive interventions in humans due to the high risk of complications, but Sarah reasoned that her certain death without intervention made the risk calculation different. She presented the veterinary research to Dr. Rodriguez, who was initially horrified by the suggestion. The treatments Sarah proposed were not approved for her condition and carried serious risks, including increased susceptibility to infections, organ damage, and potentially fatal reactions. Dr. Rodriguez explained that no ethical physician would prescribe such an experimental protocol for a human patient. But Sarah had anticipated this response. She had spent weeks researching medical tourism options and had identified a clinic in Mexico that specialized in experimental treatments for terminal patients. The clinic was run by Dr. Fernando Vasquez, a former Mayo Clinic researcher who had left conventional medicine to pursue treatments that American medical boards considered too risky. The decision to travel to Mexico for treatment was not made lightly. Sarah knew she was entering uncharted territory where the line between innovative medicine and dangerous experimentation could be razor thin. She also knew that insurance would not cover any of the costs, and she would be spending her life savings on treatments that might kill her faster than her disease. Her family was terrified. Emma begged her to reconsider, to stay home, and accept conventional palliative care. Sarah's parents alternated between supporting her determination and pleading with her to abandon what they saw as a desperate and dangerous gamble. The emotional toll of their fear added another layer of difficulty to an already overwhelming situation. But Marcus Thompson, her mentor from London, encouraged her decision. He had pursued similar experimental treatments 2 years earlier and credited them with extending his life far beyond medical predictions. He warned her that the treatment process would be brutal, but reminded her that the alternative was certain death within months. In February 2020, Sarah traveled to Tijuana to begin her experimental protocol. Dr. Vasquez's clinic was not the sterile, high-tech facility she had imagined. It was a modest building with outdated equipment and a small staff, but Dr. Vasquez himself impressed her with his extensive knowledge and genuine commitment to helping terminal patients explore unconventional options. The treatment protocol was indeed brutal. Sarah underwent a modified chemotherapy regimen designed to temporarily destroy much of her immune system, followed by targeted therapies aimed at preventing the reformed immune cells from attacking her nervous system. The process required her to stay at the clinic for 6 weeks, during which time she was essentially without immune defenses and vulnerable to any infection. The first week nearly killed her. The chemotherapy triggered violent nausea, extreme fatigue, and a dangerous drop in her white blood cell count. She developed a fever that spiked to 104 degrees, requiring emergency intervention to prevent organ failure. For 72 hours, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting battles on multiple fronts. Emma flew to Mexico to be with her sister during the crisis, convinced that Sarah's experimental gamble had backfired fatally. She spent sleepless nights in the small chair beside Sarah's bed, watching monitors that tracked her sister's vital signs and wondering if she would ever forgive herself for not fighting harder to prevent this desperate treatment attempt. But on the 4th day, something unexpected happened. Sarah's fever broke, her white blood cell count began to recover, and for the first time in months, she reported a reduction in the burning nerve pain that had become her constant companion. The tingling in her extremities, which had been steadily worsening, seemed to stabilize. Dr. Vasquez was cautiously optimistic. He explained that the initial treatment phase was designed to create a reset opportunity for Sarah's immune system. The next phase would involve carefully retraining her immune responses to prevent the autoimmune attack on her nervous system from resuming. The retraining process involved a series of treatments that sounded more like science fiction than medicine. Sarah received infusions of specially prepared immune cells that had been exposed to her own nervous tissue in controlled laboratory conditions, teaching them to recognize her nerve cells as self rather than foreign. She underwent hyperbaric oxygen sessions designed to promote nerve repair and regeneration. She received targeted injections of growth factors intended to stimulate the regrowth of damaged nerve coverings. Each treatment carried risks, and Sarah experienced side effects that ranged from uncomfortable to dangerous. The immune cell retraining caused severe fatigue and joint pain. The hyperbaric oxygen therapy triggered claustrophobia and ear pain. The growth factor injections caused swelling and inflammation at the injection sites. But throughout the ordeal, Sarah maintained meticulous records of her symptoms, treatments, and responses. Her engineering mindset helped her view each setback as data rather than failure, each small improvement as validation of her experimental approach. By the end of her 6-week stay in Mexico, the results were undeniable. Sarah's neurological function had not only stopped declining, but had begun to improve. She could write legibly for the first time in months. Her grip strength had increased significantly. The numbness in her feet had reduced from complete sensory loss to partial sensation. Dr. Rodriguez was stunned when Sarah returned for evaluation. The nerve conduction studies showed measurable improvement in multiple areas. The blood markers associated with autoimmune activity had dropped to near normal levels. Most remarkably, Sarah was walking steadily and demonstrating fine motor control that should have been impossible given her diagnosis and timeline. The improvement was not a cure, but it was something that medical literature said was impossible. Meaningful recovery from a universally fatal condition. Sarah had become the first documented case of significant functional improvement in a patient with her specific disease. The medical community's reaction was mixed. Some physicians were intrigued by Sarah's results and wanted to study her case. Others dismissed her improvement as temporary or questioned whether her original diagnosis had been accurate. A few accused her of fabricating her recovery or suggested that her condition might have been psychosomatic all along. Sarah expected skepticism from the medical establishment, but she was unprepared for the emotional challenges that came with being an impossible patient. Friends and family members who had prepared themselves for her death struggled to adjust to her recovery. Some seemed almost disappointed that their grief and farewell preparations had been premature. The loneliness of her position was profound. She couldn't simply return to her old life because her experience had fundamentally changed her. She had stared death in the face and found a way to step aside, but the process had transformed her into someone her old friends and colleagues barely recognized. Support came from unexpected sources. Other terminal patients began reaching out to her, seeking guidance and hope from someone who had achieved the impossible. Medical researchers from around the world contacted her, wanting to study her case and understand the mechanisms behind her recovery. Sarah realized that her survival carried responsibilities beyond her own life. She had inadvertently become a beacon of hope for other impossible patients, and she felt obligated to share her knowledge and experience with those facing similar battles. She began documenting her entire protocol in detail, creating a comprehensive guide that other patients might be able to adapt to their own conditions. She established connections with researchers who were willing to study unconventional treatments for rare diseases. She started a blog that chronicled her journey and provided resources for patients seeking experimental options. The work was exhausting, especially as she continued her own recovery and maintenance treatments. The protocol that had saved her life required ongoing management. She returned to Mexico every 3 months for monitoring and adjustment of her treatment regimen. She maintained a strict diet and supplement protocol. She continued the hyperbaric oxygen sessions at a facility she found in her home city. By summer, Sarah's improvement had plateaued at a level that would have seemed miraculous to her 6 months earlier. She was not completely healthy, but she was functional, independent, and alive when every medical prediction said she should be dead. Her nerve function had recovered to about 70% of normal, enough for her to return to work on a modified schedule. The aerospace company welcomed her back with enthusiasm. Her colleagues were amazed by her recovery and inspired by her determination. Some asked her to speak at company events about overcoming impossible challenges, not realizing that her battle was far from over. Sarah's success had made her a pioneer in the field of patient-directed experimental medicine, but it had also made her a target for criticism and scrutiny. She received letters from desperate patients begging for her help, researchers demanding access to her medical records, and skeptics questioning the validity of her recovery. The pressure was overwhelming at times, but Sarah drew strength from her growing network of impossible patients who were following in her footsteps. Marcus Thompson reported continued stability in his condition. A woman in Australia with a different rare disease had adapted Sarah's protocol with promising results. A support group in Canada was organizing to pursue experimental treatments based on Sarah's approach. As autumn approached, marking 1 year since her devastating diagnosis, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had survived the first phase of her impossible battle, but she understood that her war against the disease would be lifelong. The question now was whether she could maintain her gains and continue improving, or whether her condition would eventually overcome her experimental defenses. The medical establishment continued to watch her case with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Sarah had proven that survival was possible, but the challenge now was to prove that her recovery could be sustained and replicated in other patients. She was no longer the same person who had received that fatal diagnosis. She had become something new, a pioneer, a survivor, and a living challenge to the limits of medical possibility. The next phase of her journey would determine whether her breakthrough could become a breakthrough for others facing their own impossible diagnoses. 2 years after her death sentence, Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the International Conference on Rare Diseases, preparing to deliver a keynote address that would challenge everything the medical community thought they knew about terminal diagnoses. The irony was not lost on her that she was speaking to the very specialists who would have declared her case hopeless just 24 months earlier. The audience included some of the world's leading researchers in neurology and autoimmune diseases, physicians who had built their careers on understanding the limits of medical intervention, and patients advocates who had fought for decades to bring attention to rare conditions. They had come to hear from the woman who had done the impossible, not only surviving a universally fatal disease, but thriving beyond all medical predictions. Sarah's recovery had not been a smooth upward trajectory. The months following her experimental treatment in Mexico had been filled with setbacks, complications, and moments of doubt. There were times when her symptoms returned with frightening intensity, making her question whether she had simply delayed the inevitable rather than changing it. The most significant crisis occurred 8 months after her initial treatment. Sarah woke one morning to find that the numbness in her hands had returned overnight, accompanied by the familiar burning sensation that had originally driven her to seek medical attention. The sudden regression sent her into a panic that was both physical and psychological. Emergency blood tests revealed that her immune system had begun producing antibodies against her nervous system once again. The experimental reset appeared to be failing, and Sarah faced the terrifying possibility that her brief reprieve from death had come to an end. Dr. Vasquez recommended an immediate return to Mexico for a modified version of the original protocol, but Sarah's body was still recovering from the brutal effects of the first treatment series. The risk of permanent damage from a second round of aggressive therapy was substantial, and even Dr. Vasquez expressed doubts about her ability to survive another immune system reset. Instead of returning to Mexico, Sarah decided to take a different approach. She had spent the previous months building relationships with researchers around the world, and she reached out to a team at Johns Hopkins University that was studying immune system behavior in autoimmune conditions. Dr. Amanda Chun, the lead researcher, was intrigued by Sarah's case and agreed to work with her to develop a more targeted intervention. The Johns Hopkins team developed a precision medicine approach that involved analyzing Sarah's specific immune responses and designing customized treatments to address the exact pathways that were causing her autoimmune attacks. Instead of resetting her entire immune system, they would attempt to reprogram only the problematic immune cells while leaving the rest of her defenses intact. The treatment was experimental in the truest sense. Sarah became the first human subject to receive this type of precision autoimmune therapy, and the research team had no way to predict how she would respond. The protocol involved a series of treatments spread over several months, each one carefully calibrated based on Sarah's response to the previous intervention. The precision approach proved to be a breakthrough not just for Sarah, but for the entire field of autoimmune disease treatment. Her immune markers improved steadily, and her neurological symptoms not only stabilized, but continued to recover. More importantly, the treatment approach was far less traumatic than the broad-spectrum immune suppression she had undergone in Mexico. Dr. Chun and her team published Sarah's case study in the New England Journal of Medicine, marking the first time that recovery from Sarah's specific condition had been documented in peer-reviewed medical literature. The publication changed the conversation around rare autoimmune diseases from one of inevitable death to one of potential survival through innovative treatment approaches. The medical community's response to the publication was intense and divided. Conservative physicians argued that a single case study, no matter how compelling, could not overturn decades of medical understanding about a universally fatal disease. They worried that publishing such results would give false hope to patients with similar conditions and encourage dangerous treatment experiments. Progressive researchers and patient advocates celebrated the publication as evidence that the medical establishment needed to be more open to unconventional treatment approaches. They argued that rare disease patients had the right to pursue experimental treatments when conventional medicine offered no hope. Sarah found herself at the center of a medical and ethical debate that extended far beyond her individual case. She received thousands of messages from patients with rare diseases who saw her story as proof that their own supposedly hopeless conditions might be treatable. She also received criticism from physicians who accused her of promoting dangerous medical experimentation. The attention was overwhelming, but Sarah embraced her role as an advocate for impossible patients. She established the Mitchell Foundation for Rare Disease Innovation, an organization dedicated to supporting research into experimental treatments for conditions that conventional medicine considered incurable. The Foundation's first major initiative was to create a database of patients who had experienced unexpected recoveries from terminal diagnoses. Sarah had learned through her own research that such cases existed, but were rarely reported or studied systematically. Medical journals typically only published cases that confirmed existing understanding, not cases that challenged fundamental assumptions about disease progression. Working with researchers from multiple universities, the Foundation identified dozens of patients who had survived conditions with supposedly 0% survival rates. Some had recovered through experimental treatments similar to Sarah's approach. Others had experienced spontaneous improvements that their physicians could not explain. A few had recovered through unconventional therapies that the medical establishment had dismissed as quackery. The database revealed patterns that had been invisible when these cases were considered individually. Certain personality traits, lifestyle factors, and treatment approaches appeared more frequently among survivors than would be expected by chance. The Foundation began funding research into these patterns, hoping to identify factors that could improve outcomes for other terminal patients. Sarah's own recovery continued to progress. 3 years after her diagnosis, she had regained nearly 90% of her neurological function. She returned to work full-time, resumed her engineering projects, and even took up rock climbing, an activity that would have been impossible during the worst phases of her condition. The maintenance protocol she followed was significantly less intensive than her original experimental treatments. She continued with modified hyperbaric oxygen sessions twice a week, maintained a carefully designed diet and supplement regimen, and received quarterly monitoring to ensure that her immune system remained stable. Most importantly, she had learned to live with the uncertainty that came with being a medical anomaly. There were no guarantees that her recovery would be permanent, no established protocols for monitoring her long-term health, and no other patients with identical experiences to compare herself against. The psychological challenges of being an impossible patient were often more difficult than the physical ones. Sarah struggled with survivor's guilt when she connected with patients who had not been as fortunate with their experimental treatments. She felt pressure to justify her survival and to prove that her recovery was real to skeptics who continued to question her case. But she also experienced profound gratitude and purpose that gave meaning to her survival. Every day of health she experienced was a gift that statistics said she should never have received. Every patient who reached out to her for guidance represented an opportunity to help someone else find hope in the face of medical impossibility. The Foundation's work began to attract attention from major medical institutions and pharmaceutical companies. Several universities established rare disease innovation centers based on the Foundation's model. 2 biotechnology companies announced plans to develop precision autoimmune therapies based on the approach that had saved Sarah's life. Sarah's keynote address at the Rare Disease Conference became a turning point in how the medical community approached terminal diagnoses. She challenged the audience to question their assumptions about medical impossibility and to consider that patients might have insights and solutions that traditional medical training overlooked. She shared data from the Foundation's survivor database, showing that recovery from universally fatal conditions was more common than previously believed. She presented case studies of patients who had developed their own treatment protocols with remarkable success. She called for changes in medical ethics that would give terminal patients greater access to experimental treatments. The response to her presentation was electric. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but more importantly, dozens of researchers approached her afterward to discuss collaborative projects. Medical students requested mentorship in patient-directed research. Patient advocates asked for resources to help other impossible patients navigate experimental treatment options. In the 5 years following her diagnosis, Sarah had transformed from a dying patient into a leader in medical innovation. The Mitchell Foundation had funded research that led to new treatment approaches for 7 different rare diseases. The survivor database had grown to include over 300 cases of unexpected recovery from terminal conditions. Sarah's personal story had become secondary to the movement she had started. While she continued to monitor her own health and maintain her treatment protocol, her primary focus had shifted to changing how medicine approached the impossible. The aerospace company where she worked eventually promoted her to head of their innovation department, recognizing that her experience overcoming impossible challenges had given her unique insights into problem-solving and risk management. She applied the same systematic approach she had used to survive her disease to developing breakthrough technologies for space exploration. Her colleagues often asked her for advice on tackling seemingly insurmountable engineering challenges. Sarah's response was always the same. Impossible problems require impossible solutions, and impossible solutions require people willing to question everything they think they know about what's possible. On the 6th anniversary of her diagnosis, Sarah stood in her home office, looking at the wall where she had once displayed charts tracking her decline towards certain death. Those charts have been replaced with research publications, foundation achievement certificates, and photographs from conferences where she had shared her story with thousands of patients and medical professionals. She thought about the woman she had been when she first heard those words. No one survives this condition. That woman had been terrified, desperate, and facing the end of everything she had planned for her life. But that woman had also been determined, intelligent, and unwilling to accept limitations that others considered absolute. Sarah realized that her survival had never been about proving the doctors wrong. It had been about proving that the boundary between possible and impossible was not fixed, that it could be moved by individuals willing to challenge it with courage, creativity, and relentless determination. She had survived not just a fatal disease, but the belief that survival was impossible. In doing so, she had opened a door that could never be closed again. Other patients would walk through that door, armed with the knowledge that someone had gone before them and found a way. The doctors had said, no one survives her condition. Sarah had proved them wrong, step by step, and in the process had changed what was possible for everyone who came after her. Her legacy was not just her own survival, but the proof that medical impossibility was often just the limit of current imagination rather than the absolute boundary of what could be achieved. As she prepared to deliver another presentation to a new audience of impossible patients, Sarah smiled at the irony of her situation. She had become living proof that the word impossible was often just another problem waiting to be solved by someone stubborn enough to refuse to accept it.